live with our Facebook. We're live with our Facebook discussion here with the fabulous Ashley Mitchell, who's come to spend some time with Shared Beginnings. She's been here doing training on birth mom and post-placement support. We've learned a ton, and we're going to cap it off with a little interview.
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. I've been to Shared Beginnings many times, one of our partners in our post-placement support, so I'm excited to continue this conversation with adoptive families, prospective adoptive families, and Shared Beginnings clients.
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
I'm sure everyone is familiar with you, Ashley, but just in case they're not, give us just a little bit of your background.
So for those of you who don't know, my name is Ashley Mitchell. You can find me exclusively on Instagram at Big Tough Girl. Birth mom, 16 years post-placement, it'll be 17 this year, and just really navigating what it looks like in adoption, currently the climate, how we make it better, can we make it better, and the demand for post-placement care. Our team has our Need curriculum. It's the only curriculum in the nation that offers the hands-on training for the professionals, implements curriculum written by birth mothers for birth mothers, and really encourages adoptive families that are pursuing growing their family through adoption, prospective adoptive families, that they are caring about the practices of the professionals that they're choosing and working with, and making sure that the women are seen in the long term.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
I know that at Shared Beginnings, we really recognize that for an adoption, an open adoption to be successful, we've got to have strong pre and post placement services for birth moms, so that they can bring their healthiest selves into that adoptive family relationship and into the relationship with the adoptee.
Yeah, that's right.
So thank you so much for being here.
Of course.
You placed 16 years ago. I placed 34 years ago, and I can tell you there's a lot of stuff that has changed.
Yes, there is a lot of stuff.
Surprisingly, though, I think maybe a little bit more since you placed than between the time that you and I placed. I think things were kind of similar. Because we went through similar experiences, I think, at the point of placement.
Yeah, I actually think that's really interesting, because even in the generation that you placed, even farther out than me, you and I definitely probably had more similar experiences. I was right before even open adoption was even being talked about.
Yeah, and I was like one of the earliest birth moms to have an open adoption.
Social media didn't exist.
No.
Yeah.
And we didn't have post-placement.
And there was
we
no
had open adoption and pictures, but no post-placement support.
The agency managed our relationship. Like, they were the middleman between correspondence and things like that. So there was never like the direct contact right out of the gate.
Yep.
None of that.
Yeah. So much has changed. Talk a little bit about what's changed between then and now for the good, and where you think we need to still make improvements.
Definitely the conversation around openness in adoption, I think is huge. I think that's been a really amazing thing. I think we don't really honestly know what the impact of open adoption is going to look like, but we absolutely know the impact of closed adoption.
Yes.
So we're here because we've been listening to so many birth mothers, adoptees that have gone many years before us, and know that we don't want that repeated. So I think that we're in a good space there to at least bringing that awareness. I think there's still a lot of fear around it that needs to be worked through in openness for helping prospective adoptive parents and adoptive parents understand what open adoption actually is and what that looks like to navigate that. I also think that conversation around grief and trauma has definitely been more common currently. We never talked about grief and trauma. I mean, this was the narrative and the propaganda, even when I placed 16 years ago, was very much a selling point for adoptive parents. This is a beautiful and amazing thing. You're saving these children. We're giving a gift. And I think we've done a pretty good job of really shifting that. There's so much more work to do. So when I say we've done a good job, I don't think we're there yet. But I definitely think the fact that you and I are sitting on camera and on a live, first of all, technology and social media and adoption has blown this wide open. The fact that we can even sit here and talk about the fact that we had grief and trauma is like, you would have never...
And that we're birth mothers and we don't have to be ashamed of that.
Yeah. And that we're actually talking to each other as birth mothers.
Yes.
Because when was the first time you talked to a birth mother?
The first time I talked to a birth mother was when I met Ashley in June of 2022.
Yeah,
a year ago. In 34 years, that was the first time that I had ever spoken with another birth mom.
Yeah. So I think there's been beautiful changes made. I think, open adoptee records, original birth certificates, things like that are an uphill battle. It's slow. Going into courts and legislature and all that stuff is slow, but I think it's forward movement for sure.
Yeah.
I think there's still a lot of things that need work, but I think there's a lot of really amazing core communities, social media groups, organizations that are keeping the needle moving forward. Yeah.
Yes, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
I know that in my experience with all of the beautiful adoptive parents and hopeful adoptive parents that I work with here at Shared Beginnings on a daily basis, they all have fabulous hearts with the very best of intentions. And I think that so often we can find ourselves in sort of ethical dilemmas because we just don't have insight. And so what are some of the areas where you think that hopeful adoptive parents and adoptive parents need to work to avoid certain ethical pitfalls, if you will?
So if you're a Shared Beginnings client, there's probably a good chance that you've seen some of our Back to Basics education. So we talk a lot about some of these things in Back to Basics. And there's so many things that prospective adoptive parents don't know, or it's very intimidating when you're coming to the table for adoption education as a prospective adoptive parent. And I have a huge heart for adoptive parents. If you've been following me for any amount of time, my heart for educating on that level is very important to me. But it can be really intimidating to go to just social media because the internet's the wild, wild west and you never know what's going to come at you, and it can be really scary. It's scary for me as a birth mom to be on there with adoptees and hearing all the things that they're saying, and it's so complicated because I hear my son that I placed in every voice that I listen to it, so it's very complicated. The goal isn't to scare you away from pursuing adoption, but to help you be better prepared for the things that are coming in adoption. And I think that's so important to know that there are places where you can get education that really want to help you be better prepared and not just shut you down and scare you into that. I think that one of the biggest things is that prospective adoptive parents have an ethical responsibility in how their adoptions play out. And that's going to include, so it's a lot of pressure that's going to include how the pregnant mothers and then potentially becoming birth mothers are going to be treated, what's going to happen with the adoptee in that open adoption relationship. And that burden falls on the adoptive parents because they're the ones that are paying the money to the professionals to help them finalize this situation. And so if you're writing the check, you need to know where your money's going and how that's going to play out. And you need to know what your non-negotiables are when you come to the table. What is okay for you to accept and what's not. And there's so many little nuanced things from state to state with law and things like that that make this really overwhelming because you don't know that something is maybe not ethical. And I'm sitting in the room with the professional and I'm telling you as prospective adoptive parents, just because they're your professional and you're paying them doesn't mean that you don't have to do your due diligence. I want you to continue to do your research and see what you're okay with because everyone's line looks different. And just because your professional is telling you that this is okay and that this is right doesn't mean that you're going to feel that same way in the aftermath. And so you can't just blindly trust your professional and write a big check and then hope everything works out. You have a responsibility because you're a part of this constellation to ask the questions, to do the research, and walk away. And I don't say that lightly because I'm not invested in. I don't lose anything financially. There's so much coming to the table. Yeah. But I think that you have to do your due diligence as adoptive parents and challenge. I'm telling you to challenge the professionals that you're working with. Call them out. Ask them the questions. Ask for the proof. Look for the the breakdowns of the money and things like that. I think it matters on your end. I think adoptive parents need to really prepare themselves and educate themselves on grief and trauma and loss and what that's going to look like for post-placement, and it's so hard. I could educate you all day until I'm blue in the face, but until you're really in the throes of it, there's just some things you can't learn until you're in it.
Yes.
But the biggest, for those coming to the table, you have an ethical responsibility to help this adoption go well and continue, because you are going to be the ones that have to carry this relationship on long after your agency is out of the picture.
Yeah.
And so those are going to really matter long term, and you're going to have to answer to your adopted children someday about how you brought them home to you. And so those are things that need to be considered when they're walking this process.
Yes, and it's much easier to answer those questions if it's just something that you've been answering all along and very comfortable with because of the decisions that you made. We talked just a little bit in our training about the fact that there's a lot of things that are legal but not necessarily ethical, and so you can't just count on your professional to stay within the framework of the law.
That's right.
You really want them to be a organization that you agree with ethically, and is following a principle of ethics that you can be proud of going forward.
Yeah, I think at the very foundation of it, if you recognize the fact that if you're going to choose adoption to grow your family, there's going to be an ick factor to it, right?
Yeah.
There's just parts of it that are just part of the gig. You can't, to build forever families, we have to separate families. And there's just things about it that no matter how ethical you feel, no matter how legal you feel, no matter what boxes you check, there's just an ick factor to it. And if you can get straight about the things that you're saying yes to, when you pursue adoption to grow your family, and you can understand that those things are just kind of part of the deal, then you can handle things a lot better. So if you can be honest about the separation of families, if you can be honest about the grief and trauma, if you can be honest about the openness and the need for that, if you can be honest about the amount of money we pay to be able to have these social services and these things take place, if you can be really intentional about understanding what you're saying yes to, then we can do this a lot better. We can do this a lot better. But if you've convinced yourself that this is something that it's not, this is going to be harder for you in the long term, because that those waves of guilt, when things start to manifest themselves and the layers start to get peeled back, it's going to be harder to process if we weren't willing to accept them earlier on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things you talked about was if you can accept the openness.
Yeah.
So I can see from a birth mother's perspective the benefit of an open adoption, because I got to choose my daughter's family, I chose her religion, I chose the city that she'd at least be, initially raised in, right? Yeah. My adoption turned out to be picture perfect, I think, for the time, right?
Sure.
So I can really see from a birth mom's perspective how open adoption is fantastic. And it gave me some peace of mind, and I could see the family and all of that. But talk a little bit about why an adoptive parent, what's the benefit to a hopeful adoptive parent or an adoptive parent to choose open adoption?
So, we're almost 17 years into this, and we had 5 years of closed, came back together, and now we're kind of in this space of trying to navigate now what it's going to look like as he becomes an adult and things like that. Obviously, one of the core benefits of having an open adoption is the rights to information, the rights to contact, the rights to medical history, and open records, original birth certificates, and things like that are a huge part of having that openness, where if needed, some of those medical records and things like that can fill the gaps for adoptive parents, as they're the ones in the grind parenting these adoptees day after day. But the frustration of a mom, an adoptive mom, a mother going to the doctor with her child and not being able to fill out half the paperwork, and not being able to reach out and say, hey, can you send me this information? I think things like that obviously are the foundational reasons why openness is great for the adoptive mom. There's going to be, as parents, we never want to have to sit with our kids in the unknown. We always want to have answers for them. The problem with not having openness is a lot of times we start filling in the gaps with, if you're not going to fill in the gaps with answers to the adoptee's question, they're going to start doing it in their own mind. And the ways that imagination and worry and story creating in their head plays out becomes a very far cry from their reality. And so being able to say, hey, you have a question that I can't answer, but I actually know somebody that can answer that for you, is a huge piece to pouring back into the adoptee what was taken from them. And that's part of their identity and their origin story and who they are. It's the most natural thing in the world to want to know those things. And so even though there's this fear in this competition of motherhood or jealousies or insecurities around that, we have, if we can understand the roles, rights, and responsibilities that we all play in this, none of that stuff should exist. And if it pours back into the child, then that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
Yeah, that is. So let me ask you this though. Sometimes, I think we can all agree that, you know, a lot of times expectant women come to the point of adoption in a place of really bad trauma, and they may be dealing with a lot of very serious issues on their end, maybe very serious substance abuse. They may have a really serious criminal background, and they could be struggling with serious mental illness. And is there ever a time when a closed adoption or limited adoption is appropriate? And how, I realize that's probably very complex for a little Facebook Live discussion, but at a high level, you know, how do we deal with that? How do we even start?
So
maybe just start.
So I am aware that I am not always the best person to ask these kinds of questions. However, you know, I think that there's a level of understanding that needs to be had that open adoption doesn't mean visits and sleepovers and da-da-da-da-da, right? So 95% of the adoptions that are happening in the United States are open in some form or openness is about information. So all of the adoptions for the most part, I'm generalizing a little because of this question, but for the most part are open on some level. They have the name of the birth mom. They know where she lives. They have medical history. That is openness. It's either closed or open. We're not doing semi-open anymore. It's either on some scale of openness that includes, could start here with just basic name, medical history information, to maybe like where we get to have sleepovers with my son, right? And any realm in between, and completely closed. So for the most part, everyone's going to come into this with some level of openness. I think there's a few things that really need to be asked before we walk away and close adoptions. Do I think that there are situations where we should not have contact? I absolutely do. And at the end of the day, I think adoptive parents, this is adoption according to Ashley, so take it for what it's worth. I think at the end of the day, adoptive parents, especially those that are sitting in social media spaces and sitting in education spaces, are feeling a little bit, maybe not intentionally, but maybe parenting a little bit at arm's length, because they're being pounded in their heads that they're not enough and they're never going to be able to fill all the gaps and they're not the biology and blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, you're the parents. You're still the parents. You have the job of parenting in your home every single day. And so obviously the number one priority is to keep the kids safe. I do want to pose the question though, are we unsafe or are we uncomfortable? And I think when you're walking with women that have very different lifestyle choices, that are doing things or choosing things or acting in ways that are such foreign concepts to you, are you so uncomfortable with it that it's just an easy excuse to not have to be a part of it? Or are we truly unsafe? Because you can have, absolutely you can pursue and have open adoption relationships with women that are addicted. You can absolutely have open adoption relationships with women that are incarcerated. You can absolutely have open adoption relationships with women with mental illness. The question is, how much are you willing to do to educate yourself and be a little uncomfortable in life choices that you don't agree with or maybe don't even understand, versus really truly being unsafe? And I think that's a really tough question to ask. To sit in for yourself. It really calls us to maybe where our ignorances and maybe kind of self-righteous patterns and judgments and behaviors can come.
Yeah.
But we can have beautiful open adoption relationships with women in all of these situations. So there's a difference between being uncomfortable and being unsafe. And so I think that that's something to sit with personally.
Yes, and I also love the fact that you talked a little bit about like a spectrum of open adoption,
Yes.
if you will, and the fact that you can, that, you know, that's a boundary setting, probably based on where everybody is in the triad at a given time, right? Because I know that for me, there's a level of openness that I was ready for post-placement that's very different from the level of openness that I am open to today.
Yeah. And the expectation is the sleepovers. That's not the expectation. The expectation is the openness. Open adoption means that you're open and willing to be able to have access and information for the adopted child. And what does that look, and being open to the questions and the concerns and all of those things. It's not about pictures and letters. That's not, the openness is being open to the individual members of this triad. And what does that look like? Only you can, all as your own personal constellation, can understand what level of openness that looks. It happened to evolve into sleepovers. If you would have told me 17 years ago that I was going to be having a sleepover with my son that I placed for adoption, I probably would have slapped you in the face, because that is not what I wanted. We had 5 years of no contact. So, but here we are, and that's where it evolved, because that's what he wanted and needed. And so we worked around figuring that out. And so I don't want the fear of openness that there's an expectation that it has to look a certain way to keep you from pursuing whatever works for your family.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. So let's talk a little bit about the power differential in adoption. So, you know, an expectant mom comes, even though, you know, I just said, you know, they're coming in a situation where they're really probably already struggling. They're facing the trauma of a pregnancy that they're not certain how to address. But they do come with a certain level of power in the relationship. And then that power shifts. So we have the pre-placement where the power really lies in the hands of the birth mom to a great degree. And then there's that power shift. So can you talk a little bit about navigating both the pre and post differential?
Yeah, because we have a difference in privilege versus power, right? Because we know who has the privilege in the triad, which is going to be the adoptive parents, because that's the financial leverage. It's just the way that's laid out. But as far as control over the situation, whoever has the rights at that time, and don't misunderstand me, I'm not talking about control or ownership over a child, because that's not what we're looking at, but we are looking at control over rights, okay? And so, you know, and this is the reason why prospective adoptive parents go crazy in the wait with their home study paperwork, and they're, you know, calling their caseworker all the time, and have you heard anything, and fundraising and doing the money and keeping themselves busy and paying the nursery and all the things, because that's all they can control. Because at the end of the day, they don't actually have rights to anything, because the mom that is pregnant is the one that's calling all the shots. Okay? Now, depending on how she acts during that time, absolutely affects how the adoptive parents act when that power shift happens. So the power shift takes place as soon as that mom relinquishes her rights. And when that adoption is finalized in whatever capacity, whether that's at time of signature or revocation period or whatever that looks like, there's a power shift. And now all of a sudden the adoptive parents have all the control. And whatever fears, insecurities, old trauma that hasn't been healed that was triggered during this wait time, they will hold on tighter and tighter and tighter to that control. Unintentionally, that control becomes the baby. Unintentionally, that control becomes whether she has access or openness. Okay? And so now I'm sitting there, now I don't have power and I don't have privilege, and I'm sitting there with my face up against the window just hoping to make a guest appearance every once in a while. And so how tightly you hold on to that will determine whether she feels like she has a place or not. And so the adoptive parents really need to pay attention to how they're handling that power shift, because now there's power and privilege instead of just privilege.
Yes. And a long-term relationship.
Yes.
That will still be there.
And they know that there's leverage with openness.
Yes.
Because we're going to now at this point walk on eggshells and be we really don't get to do, say, or act a whole lot in certain ways, knowing that we have so much to lose.
Mm-hmm.
Because if there's a constant threat of losing openness, we can't do anything.
Yes.
We can't do anything.
Yeah.
And we don't actually have rights to do anything, so then what do we have?
Yeah.
We have our faith
best
agreement.
behavior.
Yeah, our best behavior in a faith agreement that we're trusting this random stranger is going to have integrity in their promises.
Yes.
I mean, what is for life? That's what we've got left.
Yes. Yeah.
So.
Oh, that was good. Okay, so post placement. We have talked a lot about post placement. Ashley's out here training us on the Knee to Knee support group curriculum, and for those who don't know, we do a monthly birth mom support group through Knee to Knee, hosted by Shared Beginnings, and you can find more information about that on Facebook and our website. But talking a little bit about how to manage and plan for post placement, because I really feel like that needs to be pre-placed. We need to start planning and managing post placement way before even.
Are you talking from the birth mother perspective, or
no? I'm talking about for the adoptive parent side, like, and again as a group, probably really as a triad, right? At what point should the discussion about what is our relationship going to look like post placement? I've talked to a lot of birth moms now, and I'm surprised at how few have had a conversation with their hopeful adoptive parents about what it all seems to be very, very generalized.
Well,
and maybe it needs to be that way.
Well, I don't know. There's going to be a lot of controversy around this, because it's like, how much of the post stuff do you talk about before you cross over a weird line into like coercion or expectation of placement? And so I think and you have to remember the intake that the pregnant moms have is a very different intake than the adoptive parents have. So I think that the adoptive parents and the prospective adoptive parents and their intake should absolutely be talking about this and including this and what the expectation is, and what they want this to look like, and what the standards of ethics and care are for Shared Beginnings, and that level that they expect of their clients. It gets a little bit trickier when you're sitting with the pregnant moms to push too much long-term care for them without crossing into coercion and manipulation. So it's a complicated question. It's like, for the agencies, there is no question. They offer it or they don't, and the standard practice in the nation is that they offer post-placement care, period. Yeah. It's 2023, we're not offering. And if you're working with an agency that says they offer it, I want a breakdown of what they actually offer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What is it really?
Yeah. What does their post-placement services actually look like? Because I promise you, if you're just reading this very scripted blurb on their website, what they're offering is not what the women are getting, and that is a huge responsibility that falls on, again, prospective adoptive parents. If they're choosing an agency based on the claim of post-placement care, what does that actually look like? So I think the conversation with the agencies and the adoptive families need to happen right at intake, right at the beginning, and with an expectation carried through. And because post-adoption contract agreements are not legally binding in a lot of states, it's really complicated to kind of navigate what that looks like. But as far as having that conversation with the pregnant women, I think that they need to know services, but I think until that relinquishment happens, it gets really tricky to have that conversation with them without making them feel like the expectation is placement.
Yeah. And I also think that's a really good point, that there's no out for me. The expectation is that this is already a done deal, right? Yeah. And I remember too, in one of the videos that I watched when I was doing my training through Shared Beginnings, even though I came on in accounting, I still, just so you know, all the Shared Beginnings staff go through the training. One of the things I think that was mentioned there was that you really need to be very cautious of what you say, because for a expectant mom, things can really be viewed as a promise.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
I can remember that there were some things that we just had in discussion, my adoptive mom and I, and yet I look back on that and think, well, she said she would do that.
Yeah.
But, she just had a conversation.
But you have to understand that the women really are, if you say you're going to do something and they choose to place because of that reason and that doesn't happen, they really do feel so deeply betrayed on a level that can never be repaired.
Yeah.
And I don't say that lightly. It's the same when we're talking about post-adoption parents, to be very careful and specific about what they offer, because a lot of families will come in and offer everything, and you're going to want to offer everything, and you're going to want to pour your heart. And if you're waiting until the hospital to think about these things, this is why I think it should happen with adoptive parents very early on. Because what's going to happen is this newborn baby is going to be placed in your arms, and you're going to be like, you can have whatever you want. You just gave me your baby. We can't do that because that's not a realistic offering. And so being able to at least prepare the prospective adoptive parents' minds for being realistic of fact that they're bringing a newborn baby home. They have no idea what their postpartum could potentially look like, what adjusting to this baby is. Do you have other kids at home? What's your life going to look like now that things have shifted? And so promising everything in an emotional state, we need to be prepping that ahead of time. Yeah.
How common is it for a birth mom to kind of withdraw initially, or within a certain amount of time? And then how should adoptive parents deal with that if and when that happens?
So obviously there's so many nuances, and that's why, education is so complicated, because you can hear one thing from one side and one thing from the other. But generally, the women are going to go through, their grief cycles are going to be all over the place. And because this is such a disenfranchised grief that has no real closure to it, the triggering happens continuously. Because every birthday we know that our child's getting a year older, and a whole year of things that we missed and is just out there living somewhere, holidays, all of those things, a song, a smell, whatever. And that's true for trauma, but with no closure in this loss, whereas it doesn't have the finality of like a passing of a loved one or something like that. It's a continuous thing, and so their grief cycles are going to change all the time, and that's not even in taking into consideration mental health, addiction, and things like that, which also triggers the issues. Okay. So, but typically what we've seen nationally is really they hit that kind of 1 year mark. There's a little bit of a honeymoon phase that typically can come into these relationships. They hit that 1 to 2 year mark, and then could go into 5 to 7 years of complete silence and withdraw and isolated grieving moms.
Yeah.
It's really hard for adoptive parents during it's really fascinating how parallel our journeys really are, and how much we experience so many of the similar things at the same time, but never talk to each other about it. But during that time, these adoptive parents have this expectation of openness and this beautiful picture, and what they would like this to look like, and what they want for their children and for themselves. And the mom bonds with this birth mom in a way that is just, I'm tied to an invisible string to Derek's mom that I chose to be the parent. I mean, I can feel her pull all the time. And so wanting that deep connection with her, and then she's gone, and you have a one-sided relationship, and that's really painful and sad, and there's grieving there that adoptive parents go through, and then there's guilt that she's struggling so much because we were a part of her loss, and so it's this whole cycle for adoptive parents as well. And so, and in no other situation would you allow kind of the whiplash of the way the things kind of pull in and out, but this is just kind of one of those things where it's like, we have to have thicker skin. We have to be a little more tolerant. We have to have some of these things so that we can continue to keep the door open for this relationship to continue if and when she decides to return. And another really important thing to just kind of remember is that the open adoption relationship isn't about you and her, it's about her and her child. Open adoption relationships aren't set up, the concept of open adoption isn't set up so that the adopted parents and the birth mom can be best friends.
Right.
That's not what it's supposed to look like. It doesn't matter if you guys like each other or hang out or talk every day, even if that's what you would like. The point of open adoption is so that the adoptee has contact and connection. So the biological parents and the adopted parents don't have the expectation to hang out, talk. They don't even have to like each other that much, but they have to respect each other and love the child enough to make things work.
Right.
And so if you can shift the mindset that the openness is really about the child and the biological family, then we can ease some of that a little bit, I think.
That's good. And it's good just to be aware of the fact that withdrawal doesn't mean disinterest.
Right. Just silence doesn't mean stop is what we talk about in openness. Silence doesn't mean stop. And so if you send a text message or you send a gift and you don't hear anything from her and your feelings are hurt about that, and you didn't get a response or a thank you or things like that, then we're sending the things for the wrong reason. The point of those kinds of things is to keep the door open. And adopted parents will be so afraid that if she doesn't respond, that you caused more pain for her. I'm afraid to send something because I don't want it to bring up feelings for her. You don't get to actually determine that. Your commitment to her was to send the stuff, to keep the communication open, to send the picture. She's the only one that can determine how she feels about it. She's the only one that can decide if she wants to open it and read it or not. She's the only one that gets to decide if she's grieving right now or not. You don't get to withhold because you don't want to make it harder for her. You don't get to determine that. And so understanding what your commitment was to send, and if you're honoring that part of it, the other part is not on you. And so
right, they're doing their job.
Yeah, you've done what you've been asked to do. And really at the end of the day, you were asked to do one thing. That was to take that child and to love that child and to parent that child. Are you doing that? Are you really doing that? Then the rest is just gravy.
Yeah. That's good. I just love talking to you. Okay, I just have 2 more questions for you. Okay, so for a lot of adoptive parents and birth moms, they're first timers. They haven't had a triad relationship before, right? And it makes sense that going into it, like you said, we have this picture of how this is going to be and how, maybe fabulous, maybe scary. But
yeah, depending on whether you watch Lifetime movies or, depending on where you're getting your education. Yeah.
I was just thinking in our discussion, I've never seen an Oprah show that had an open relationship with a mom and a birth mom who had no drama and, or even with drama. But it makes sense that post-placement, you had a wish for the way things were going to be. And post-placement, you could change your mind. This was not what you probably are going to find, that there's some things here that I had not thought about, So what, if you're, let's say a birth mom, for example, says, oh man, I thought I could do this with just a picture and a card, but I am really suffering here and I feel like I want more. I mean, what is your suggestion around any kind of negotiating that dilemma? Because that can be probably a scary thing on both sides.
Yeah. So I think this is something that gets missed in education a lot, that I think people need to talk more about, is the fact that we can change our mind and we can adjust how we're doing our openness. It can fluctuate and change. There's an ebb and flow to everything. We have mediation for everything. Why aren't we coming back to the table every year and saying, this worked really well for me this year, this didn't? Are there things about this open relationship that you liked, things that you didn't? Oh, you want to try that this year? Awesome. Let's do that and see how it goes. You've had relationships with humans before. You know how to adjust and compromise and communicate. And your marriages aren't the same as when you first met. Why would you expect that 17 years later at the hospital, when nobody was thinking clearly, that our relationship wasn't going to evolve and change? Good, bad, ugly, it needs to be flexible and just be a human relationship.
Yeah.
And so if something's not working, let's come back to the table and talk about it. It doesn't have to stay the same. Sometimes, some years it's going to be less, and sometimes it's going to be more, and sometimes we've kind of gotten into a groove where things are really good, and so we're just going to keep going the way that we are for a while until something hits us and this has really not been working the way I thought it was, and we're going to adjust. This is, when they say adoption is for life, like, we're not kidding.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, it's, and that's so hard to comprehend and wrap your mind up, because a year can literally feel like a lifetime, and so you have however many lifetimes those years are going to look like. But if you really believe that you're going to come into this and set this open adoption expectation, and that's what you guys are going to decide on before she signs that paperwork, and you haven't adjusted in 6 years, we have a problem.
Yeah.
We haven't grown. No one's done any work. We're not actually really being honest with each other. Come back to the table. Are these working for you? Are these pictures working for you? Is this not working for you? And adjust accordingly. Now, the only time that that's different is if you don't have contact with her. And at that point, you don't have a choice but to continue to do what you've been doing.
And at some point, the adoptee is going to have a voice.
Yeah, that's right. And then when the adoptee gets old enough to really have a voice and the open adoption actually begins, then you adjust according to the needs of the child and the desires of his connection to biology.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
That's good. I like room for growth and change. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, last question. So give us your top 5. I am a hopeful adoptive parent, and I am looking for a adoption agency. What are the top 5 questions that I should be asking an agency?
Okay, top 5 questions that you need to ask. Are you actually licensed in the state that you're soliciting mothers from? So here's, I have 5 I'll try not to go too long into each thing. State laws were written specifically where agencies could only like advertise in like the yellow pages or the nickel page or whatever, okay? And so they weren't able to advertise outside of where they were licensed. So that was a little more controlled. The internet came in and blew that wide open, but the laws never changed to adjust to the internet. So now people are, if I go to Google and say closest agency to me, I'm not actually getting the agency that's closest to me. I'm getting the agency that paid for the highest Google clicks. Mm-hmm. So I could be getting an agency in a state that I don't live in, and then we start getting into flying women across state line and transferring women, and we don't want to do that. You need women to have an agency that has boots on the ground, that has the social services, that can pay attention to her, so that we're not placing through emails and text messages and a little folder that she takes with her to the hospital. So are you working with an agency that is licensed in the place where she lives, that she has resources, okay? What are the fees for? Break down the fees. If there's a matching fee, why are you paying a matching fee? If you're paying a matching fee, then why are you also having to solicit on Facebook, etc., and set up a page on Instagram and also help with the advertising of yourself if you're paying matching fees? That's what those fees are supposed to go to. What are the birth parent expenses? How are they being paid out? What's the cap in your state, right? So if we have a state like Ohio where the cap is $3,000, if one agency is itemizing that and taking the receipts to the judge, even though they don't have to, and the agency up at the street is giving a lump sum of $3,000, there's a difference in, it's all legal because it's $3,000, but different in ethics, mm-hmm. right? So the breakdown of the money. That's 3. Number 4, what are the post-placement services, and what do they actually mean, and what do they actually look like? Does the woman have separate legal representation? The legal representation to do the finalizations should not work with you and work with her. They will never be equal. They are always going to care more for you than they're going to care for her, because you're the one that's paying their check. They need to have separate legal representation so that they can ask questions, that if they want a parent, they have someone that's there to advocate for them and their needs. If you have someone that's bouncing back and forth, managing the emotional needs of both, the moms are going to be neglected every time in that space. Yeah.
Because in the end, you want a parent, but you don't want to parent the child of someone who wanted to have their child. Yeah. Thank you.
Of course,
wow,
of course.
That went much better than I thought. That was my first time.
She did great. She did great. Was there any questions? Is there any questions that have popped up, or anything specific that people wanted to ask? like thumbs down or hearts or mad faces at anything that we said. Well, I love being partnered with Shared Beginnings. The only agency, child placing agency in the state of Arkansas that offers our program. I've been in here and trained them personally. They are required to, they require their families to run our education. I've seen intake forms. I know a lot of the inner workings here, and I'm very honored to partner with Shared Beginnings.
We're honored to partner with you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ashley.
Of course. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Someone said so good, so much insight. I'm Julia's neighbor, and I loved listening to your conversation.
Oh, good.
We got
Thank
lots
you.
Of hearts.
Good. Thank
deal.
you.
Thanks, guys.
Come and follow me at Big Tough Girl. If you're not already following me, any of the people here at Shared Beginnings can answer these same kinds of questions. But if you want one-on-one conversation from someone who's not associated with the agency and you have questions about ethics or anything like that, I'm happy to do that as you're vetting potential agencies to work with.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Well done.
Does that one off?